Hello and welcome to LSAT Logic Applied. I'm your host, Andrew Leahy, an assistant teaching professor of law at Drexel Klein School of Law. This is a short format podcast where I take the tools from LSAT logical reasoning, assumptions, flaws, causation, strength, and weaken, and apply them to real-world claims in the news, science, and public discourse. For those that don't know, the LSAT is the law school admission test, a standardized exam designed to assess logical reasoning, analytical thinking, and reading comprehension for law school applicants. It's a high-stakes test with a unique focus on how arguments work and how they fall apart. The LSAT is owned and administered by the Law School Admission Council, or LSAC. I don't claim any ownership or affiliation. I'm just here to teach the logic. And you don't need to be studying for the LSAT to follow along. The point is to learn how to spot weak or incomplete reasoning in everyday life. The same kind of reasoning the LSAT trains you to attack under time pressure. Today's episode looks at a claim in public finance and government policy. Here's the background. The U.S. Postal Service has announced that it will suspend employer pension contributions, a move expected to free up about $2.5 billion this year, 2026. Officials say the agency is facing a looming cash crisis and could run out of money within a year without major reforms, things like raising stamp prices, cutting delivery days, or increasing borrowing authority. Importantly, USPS says this pause will have no immediate impact on current or future retirees. Employees will still be able to contribute to their pensions and other retirement programs remain in place. So the implicit argument looks something like this. USPS is running out of cash. Suspending pension contributions frees up billions. Therefore, suspending pension contributions is a justified and necessary step to maintain operations. Let's break down the claim and look at the structure of the argument. It looks like this. There is an urgent financial shortfall. A specific action will generate immediate cash relief. That action helps address the shortfall. Therefore, that action is necessary or justified as the appropriate response. That's the core move. And importantly, it's not obviously wrong. Freeing up $2.5 billion does address a real constraint, especially if that constraint is financial and looks like $2.5 billion. But the claim does more than one thing at once. So let's take our LSAT lens and kind of look a little bit closer. So first of all, what we have is some parallel reasoning, which is a valid method. So we'll start with what the argument gets right. This is actually a recognizable and often valid reasoning method. You identify a problem, you identify a measure that alleviates that problem, and you infer that the measure is a reasonable response. Abstractly, the structure looks like this. A system faces a constraint. A particular action reduces that constraint. Therefore, that action improves the system's position. That's generally sound reasoning. On the LSAT, this is analogous to showing that a proposed solution directly addresses a known weakness. It's pragmatic, it's outcome-oriented, and it connects means to ends. So far, so good. But there's a parallel flaw here, or where the argument kind of slips. It comes in the shift. The argument moves from this action helps address the cash problem to something closer to this action is necessary or justified as the solution. That's a different claim entirely. Here's the abstract structure of the flaw. A problem exists, one action would help address it, therefore that action should be taken, or maybe even is required. That leap assumes that this option is uniquely appropriate, but that assumption isn't established. There are alternative explanations and alternative solutions already in the record. Raising stamp prices, reducing delivery days, increasing borrowing authority, or restructuring obligations more broadly. On the LSAT, this is a classic issue, failing to consider competing alternatives. There's a necessary versus sufficient confusion here. The argument implicitly treats this action as if it were necessary. But what we're actually told is that it is sufficient to generate cash. Those are not the same. Freeing up $2.5 billion helps, but it does not follow that only this action, or even this action in particular, is required. On the LSAT, this is one of the most common logical errors, confusing something that works with something that must be done. And there's a causal oversimplification here. The reasoning also simplifies the causal story. The financial crisis is attributed to a general lack of cash. The solution targets one source of outflow, pension contributions, but the underlying causes are broader. Declining mail volume, competition from private carriers, inflation, and structural funding obligations. Treating one lever as the key fix risks overstating its role. There is also some scope shift here. Notice the expansion in scope. The evidence shows this action frees up cash in the short term. The conclusion becomes this is a justified step to maintain operations overall. That's much broader. It moves from a narrow financial effect to a general policy justification. On the LSAT, this is a familiar move, expanding from a limited effect to a wider conclusion. And we also have an alternative framing problem. There's a subtle sort of framing issue here. The data could support a narrower conclusion. Something like, this is one way to temporarily improve liquidity, but the argument leans toward, this is a necessary or appropriate response to this crisis. Those are not equivalent. One is limited and descriptive, the other is normative and much broader. So, what's missing? What would boost or bust the argument? To strengthen the argument, we would want to know whether alternative measures would be less effective or more costly, whether suspending contributions has minimal long term consequences, and whether similar actions have successfully stabilized finances in comparable situations. On the other hand, the argument will be weakened if other options could generate equal or even greater cash with fewer risks. The suspension creates larger long term liabilities or funding gaps, or the crisis itself is overstated or avoidable through different mechanisms. In other words, the issue is not whether this action helps, it probably does. It's whether that fact supports treating it as the right or necessary solution. Obviously, this episode isn't really about the Postal Service or public finance more generally. It's about how we move from identifying a solution to claiming that solution is justified or required. On the LSAT, the hardest questions often live somewhere in that transition. Here we saw both sides, a reasonable reasoning method, linking a policy to a real constraint, and a potential flaw, treating one workable solution as if it were the only workable solution. The key questions are, does the evidence rule out alternatives? Are we confusing helps with must? And does the conclusion match the scope of the evidence? Good reasoning often contains the seeds of bad reasoning if we push it too far. With that, I thank you for listening to LSAT Logic Applied. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more short episodes where we apply clean logic to messy real-world claims. See you next time.